Hello. The Divine Code for November 17th, pages 325 and 326. We are in the chapter Maimed or Broken Limbs. Topic number 6. If a portion of the protruding bone splits off that is less than half the bone's thickness and is separated from the body, and the remaining flesh and skin would be sufficient to cover the bone, that the bone had the portion of the bone not fallen off. The remaining limb below the break is acceptable. So we're talking about where a bone is splits. An animal's bone splits, and the split part is protruding out of the skin. If it's possible to kind of, put the flesh back over the bone, then there's no question that the limb is still okay. That it's not a limb separated from a living animal, because it's still part of the animal. If, however, the protruding bone splits and the portion was separated off had a majority of the bone's thickness and or circumference, the remaining bone is considered as if it has been cut off, because it will not heal. Hence, it is considered a hanging limb. Shokanoric Eurydeia, chapter 55, and is governed by the precept cited in chapter 4, that's this chapter, topics 1 and 2. That was the beginning of the chapter. And what it says there is that in the case of a hanging limb, the majority would approve of it being used as for meat after the animal's been slaughtered. There is opinions, including the Rambam. So major opinions would say that it's forbidden as being separated from a living animal. So the question is whether a hanging limb, where most of the limb has been detached from the animal, there's a dispute as to whether or not it's allowed for food after the animal's been slaughtered. And after the animal's been slaughtered, it's all rabbinic anyway. So there's an argument about the rabbinic prohibition of limb of a living animal in the case of a hanging limb. What it's saying here in topic number 6 is that if the majority of the bone can be covered with flesh, then it's not considered a hanging limb. It's just considered a messed up limb, but it's still considered. All the rabbis would agree that that is not a limb separated from a living animal. And that's what topic number 6 is saying. Topic number 7. To determine whether the skin or flesh cover a majority of the broken bone, one should place the limb in its former position and then bring the flesh and skin together, and he will thus see whether they cover the majority. Rokia and Taz Eurydeia 55:5. The leniency above, allowing the flesh around a broken and protruding bone to be considered acceptable if the animal's flesh and skin. So this is the leniency on the disputed rabbinic stringency or offense. It's considered acceptable if the animal's flesh and skin covers a majority of circumference and diameter, applies only when it is the flesh that could cover the greater part of that portion, and the skin is merely a secondary factor that's an aid to healing. If, however, the flesh and skin play equal roles in covering the bone, it is unacceptable because it will not naturally heal. So this is all, the question is whether or not this limb is, if it's a hanging limb, then it's open to dispute. And if it's possible to kind of replace the animal's bone back into its normative position. And if the flesh, because if the animal had been injured, it's possible the flesh was ripped away from the bone in such a way that you're not going to be able to cover the bone back up. In that case, it would be considered a hanging limb. If the flesh is still there and can be kind of moved back over the bone, then it's not considered a hanging limb. It's just a broken limb. And the question of skin, normally that would not be sufficient to place it out of the category of a hanging limb. It's except in the factors that are going to be brought up here now. If, however, the flesh and skin play equal roles in covering the bone, it is unacceptable because it will not naturally heal. So, if it was given a chance to heal, this limb would not be able to heal if it was not, unless there was a majority of flesh over the bone. The above applies to domesticated or wild animals. With regard to bird, by contrast, since the skin is soft, it is considered a combination with the flesh, and when the broken or protruding bone could be covered in this manner, half with flesh and half with skin, the limb is acceptable. This is Torah and Shulchan Aruch chapter 55, based on Rashba. If, however, it could be covered in this manner only, or primarily by the remaining skin, it is not acceptable, even for a bird. So a bird has, okay, we need to be able to cover half of the bone with flesh in order for it to be considered a broken rather than a hanging limb. So for an animal, it has to be 50% of the bone is covered with flesh. There helps the healing process, but it cannot be counted towards that 50%. In the case of a bird, we're still looking for the 50% of the bone being covered. However, 25%, up to 25% of the bone being covered can be done with skin, and then the other 25% would have to be done with flesh, with meat. If it was we did not have the 25% of meat. Let's say it was being covered 50% with flesh, but only 20% was with meat flesh, and the other 30% was with skin. That would not count enough. It has to be at least half of the total amount. That's the 50%. The total amount necessary is 50%. So it can be a combination of meat. For a bird, it can be a combination of meat and flesh. Meaty flesh and skin can be combined to make the 50%, but at least half of, or that'd be 25% of the bone would have to be covered with the flesh, and the other 25% could be covered with the skin. But it has to be at least 25% of the bone being covered with flesh. And that's only for a bird. It's not for a land mammal. Topic number 8, the leniency in topic 4.7 above. That's talking about the skin of birds. Is acceptable by all authorities. That is allowing the flesh of a broken protruding bone to be acceptable when the majority of the bone's circumference and diameter is able to be covered by the remaining flesh. But this only applies when that is the ordinary pattern. When the bone is one that is never covered with flesh, but merely with skin. For example, the knee. So the knee, the joint of the knee doesn't normally have flesh surrounding it, and therefore it wouldn't be necessary to have 50% of it being covered with flesh, not counting skin, because even in the normal circumstances, it's not covered 50% with flesh. So it wouldn't be necessary to have 50% of flesh being covered in the case of the injury. It is acceptable, according to all authorities, for it to be able to be covered just with the remaining skin. Tor, Rashba, Shokanor, Uridea, 55:16. This leniency mentioned, the bone is covered only by skin, is because there is a doubt regarding the law of Tractate Kulin 76b and Rambam, Laws of Forbidden Foods 5.8, rose on the lenient side to permit the limb. Hence, the law mentioned in Tor and Shokanoric is to be stringent because of the doubt. The rule is that a doubt is ruled. Stringency applies to Jews, but not to Gentiles. And that was also discussed in chapter 6, topic 8 below, or will be discussed. So, in the Jewish law, if there's an uncertainty, in the Jewish rabbinic law, if there's an uncertainty about something, the tendency is to become stricter about it. In the same case, in this case, for example, there's a uncertainty, and therefore the uncertainty goes towards a leniency. It goes towards less strict. Whereas for a Jew, it becomes more strict. That's kind of a rule of thumb with these uncertainties. So that's the reason why. That's the reason why they're allowing the knee for in the case of a Gentile, but maybe apparently, according to what's said here, according to the Jewish halakha, it would not be acceptable, but in a Gentile halakha, it would be acceptable. Even if other portions of the body, where the majority of the circumference and diameter of a broken and protruding bone must be able to be covered by both skin and flesh for it to be acceptable according to all authorities. The leniency granted in the following instance: no flesh is available in that place to cover the bone, and apparently no flesh is available in that place to cover the bone in its manner, rather only the skin. But where there are bodily fluids, it would be between the skin and the replaced bone, and the skin was able to retain. We're looking at Shokanoric Uridea 55:8. So I would assume that this is referring to the lower parts of the skin, that if the lower, which is a lot more fluid in it. And if the lower parts of the skin are able to go over, in the case of the leniencies, that might be sufficient, or would be sufficient to consider it a maimed rather than a hanging limb. Also, the case of um, the case of the leniency is apparently concerning the bird having 50% of its bone being covered, half with skin and half with meat. That footnote was concerning that question rather than the question of the knee being covered. Um, soft sinews that will eventually become firm, and needless to say, firm sinews. Now, for most of us, it would still need to be said for firm sinews because this is a logic. It should be logical. It should be obvious logically from a rabbinic mindset that if soft sinews that will become hard, that would include sinews that are already hard. It might be better to say it should be obvious. But there's a number of places within the divine code where the term "it should be obvious" is mentioned, and it would probably be better to add in "should be obvious" for those of us who are not totally fluent in the logical process here. Soft sinews that will eventually become firm, and needless to say, firm sinews are not considered part of the flesh and are not included when reckoning the extent to which the bone will be able to be covered. And that's from the Shulchan Aruch Yoreh De'ah 55:9. So when we're doing this mathematical thing, we're looking at the animal, trying to determine whether or not 50% of the bone is covered. We would not include, we already said we would not include the skin in the case of mammals, or a portion of the skin is allowed in the case of birds, but sinews are not included as flesh. They're not counted towards 50% flesh when making these observations and making these determinations. The sinews would not be counted, or at least sinews that are either hard or not, or are going to become hard. Thank you.